The flames dancing in his beard cast shadows that made grown men weep like children. And when Edward Teach smiled, the very ocean seemed to hold its breath in terror. Picture this, a world where the Caribbean sun beats down mercilessly on wooden ships, creaking under the weight of stolen treasure, where the smell of gunpowder mingles with salt spray, and where a man's reputation could be worth more than all the gold in Tortuga. This is the stage upon which our tale unfolds, a blood-soaked theater, where death and glory dance hand in hand across the waves. The year is 1680, give or take a season, and somewhere in the sprawling port city of Bristol, a child draws his first breath of English air. Bristol, that magnificent beast of commerce where ships arrive heavy with sugar and depart laden with dreams of empire. The city pulses with the rhythm of the Atlantic trade, its cobblestones worn smooth by the boots of merchants, sailors, and dreamers, all chasing the same golden horizon. But let's not pretend we know this child's true name with certainty, for mystery clings to him like barnacles to a ship's hull. Edward Teach? Edward Tatch? Perhaps some clever variation designed to confuse the tax collectors and bounty hunters, who would later seek his head. In an age where a man's past could be as easily shed as a snake's skin, our protagonist understood the power of reinvention before he could even spell his own name. Some whisper he was born under Jamaican stars, the child of very creditable parents, a delicious irony considering what he would become. Others claim the tobacco fields of North Carolina witnessed his first cries. Truth, as you'll discover, was never Edward's strongest currency. He traded in something far more valuable, fear wrapped in legend, seasoned with just enough reality to make strong men check the horizon twice before sleeping. The Bristol of his youth was no gentle nursery. It was England's second city, a roaring port where fortunes were made and lost on the turn of a tide. Young Edward, let's call him that, though he might laugh at our presumption, would have grown up breathing the heady mixture of tar, rum, and possibility that hung over the harbor like incense in a pagan temple. The masts of merchant vessels created a forest of ambition stretching toward the sky, each one a prayer for safe passage and profitable return. This was the world that shaped him, brutal, magnificent, unforgiving. The England of his childhood was flexing its colonial muscles, late to the imperial feast but determined to feast nonetheless. Virginia tobacco, Barbados sugar, and the endless stream of human cargo that made it all possible, these were the ingredients of empire. And young Edward tasted them all in the salty air of his hometown. But our story truly begins when the boy becomes a man and trades the familiar cobblestones of Bristol for the rolling deck of a privateer-s vessel. The War of the Spanish Succession, that grand chess game played across oceans with ships as pawns and nations as players, had just erupted across Europe like a powder keg in a chandler's shop. King Charles II of Spain had died childless, leaving his vast empire hanging like ripe fruit waiting to be plucked. Would the French grasp the Spanish crown? Would the Austrians? The English and Dutch certainly weren't going to stand by and watch Paris and Madrid unite under one royal house. And so the cannons roared, from the battlefields of Flanders to the sugar islands of the Caribbean. And every conflict creates opportunities for those bold enough or desperate enough to seize them. Enter the privateer, that magnificent legal fiction that allowed civilized nations to wage war while keeping their hands technically clean. A privateer was a pirate with paperwork, a brigand with royal blessing. Queen Anne's government needed ships to her Spanish treasure fleets, but the Royal Navy was stretched thin and the Royal Treasury thinner. So why not issue letters of marque to enterprising sea captains? Let them fund their own expeditions, keep their own prizes, and if anyone complained about their methods, well, they were acting in a private capacity, weren't they? Young Edward Teach found himself swept up in the sanctioned mayhem, his keen mind and natural courage catching the attention of experienced captains who needed reliable men. The Caribbean had become a vast hunting ground where Spanish ships heavy with New World silver made tempting targets for Queen Anne's unofficial navy, and Edward, whatever his true name, whatever his real origins, proved himself a hunter worthy of the name. Picture him in those early days, tall, lean, his black hair not yet grown into the legendary beard that would terrorize a hemisphere. He moved through the Caribbean like a shark through bloody water, learning the rhythm of wind and tide, the weight of a cutlass in his hand, the satisfying crack of a musket ball finding its mark. He was not yet the monster of legend, merely a skilled predator learning his trade in waters that forgave no mistakes. But the seas were teaching him more than seamanship. They were showing him the intoxicating taste of absolute freedom, the godlike power that came with commanding a ship and crew in waters where law was measured in cannon shot and justice came at the point of a sword. Here, far from the prying eyes of magistrates and the suffocating propriety of civilized society. A man could become anything he dared to be. The accounts speak of his uncommon boldness and personal courage, but they failed to capture the electricity that must have coursed through him as he stood on a swaying deck with enemy shot whizzing overhead, and victory or death balanced on the edge of a cutlass. This was no counting house or gentleman-s estate. This was raw existence stripped to its essential elements: courage, cunning, and the will to take what you wanted from a world that gave nothing freely. For years, Edward served under other men's commands, always the subordinate, always following orders, always watching others claim the lion's share of the prize money. But he was learning, absorbing every lesson the sea had to teach about leadership, navigation, combat, and the delicate art of managing desperate men in desperate circumstances. He understood that a crew's loyalty was earned through success and spent through failure. That respect came not from birth or title, but from the ability to deliver gold and glory in equal measure. Then came 1713, and with it the crushing weight of peace. The Treaty of Utrecht ended the War of the Spanish Succession with the stroke of diplomats' pens. But no treaty could undo the transformation it had wrought in thousands of fighting men. Imagine the shock. One day you're a sanctioned warrior serving queen and country. The next you're an unemployed sailor with a ship, a crew, and skills suited only for violence. The governments that had so eagerly issued letters of marque now wanted their pet wolves to become lambs to return to tending shop, or following a plow, as if the past decade of blood and thunder had been nothing but a fevered dream. Many tried to make that transition. They sold their ships, divided their prize money, and attempted to disappear into the anonymous masses of England's growing population. But for men like Edward Teach, who had tasted the wine of absolute freedom and found it sweeter than any earthly vintage, such a retreat was impossible. The sea had claimed them as surely as any siren's song, and the sea does not easily release its chosen children. The choice was stark: return to obscurity and slow death by respectability, or continue the dance with different partners. Piracy, the word itself, carried weight like a loaded pistol. No longer would they sail with royal approval. Now they would face the hangman's rope if caught. But the skills remained the same. The ships still floated, and the Spanish treasure fleets still crossed the Caribbean loaded with silver and gold.
Edward made his choice the way a man chooses to breathe, without conscious thought, driven by a need too fundamental to question. He turned his back on legitimate employment and threw his lot in with the outcasts and rogues who would remake the Caribbean in their own chaotic image. The age of the privateer was ending. The age of the pirate was about to begin. His first birth was aboard the ship of Stede Bonnet, the so-called gentleman pirate, a contradiction in terms that perfectly captured the confused spirit of those transitional times. Bonnet was a Barbados plantation owner who had abandoned his comfortable life for reasons that remain mysterious. Perhaps his wife was insufferable. Perhaps the sugar business had grown boring. Or perhaps he simply heard the same siren call that had claimed Edward. Whatever his motivations, Bonnet represented everything wrong with genteel attempts at piracy. Too civilized for his new profession, too kind for the necessary cruelties, too accustomed to giving orders to men who respected his position rather than his person. Edward served as a foremast man under Bonnet, but it must have been like watching a child play with a loaded cannon. The gentleman pirate's crew grew restless under his indecisive leadership, and when the moment came, they did what desperate men had always done. They chose competence over courtesy and made Edward their captain. It was his first real command, his first taste of the absolute authority that would define the rest of his abbreviated but spectacular career. No longer did he answer to admiralty officials or privateering commissioners. The only law was what he chose to make it. The only constraint was what his crew would accept, and the only master was the sea itself. Under his leadership, the crew's fortunes improved dramatically. Where Bonnet had hesitated, Edward struck. Where the gentleman pirate had shown mercy, the new captain showed the calculated brutality that kept crews in line and enemies in terror. Word began to spread through the network of Caribbean ports and anchorages. There was a new player in the game, and he played by rules entirely of his own making. The transformation was remarkable to witness. The young man who had once followed orders without question now gave them with the absolute confidence of a natural leader. His voice carried the weight of command. His presence dominated any room or deck he entered. in his tactical mind, grasped the complexities of Caribbean piracy with an intuitive genius that left even experienced buccaneers shaking their heads in amazement. But it was more than mere competence that set him apart. Edward Teach possessed that indefinable quality that transforms a skilled criminal into a legendary figure. He understood the power of theater. He grasped that reputation could be worth more than any treasure chest, that fear properly cultivated could accomplish what cannon and cutlass could not. He began to craft his image with the same careful attention that a painter gives to his masterpiece. The beard came first, that magnificent, terrifying cascade of black hair that would become his trademark and his weapon. He grew it long and wild, braiding it into elaborate patterns, weaving colored ribbons through it like some demonic maypole. In battle, he would light slow matches and tuck them into the tangled mass, so that he appeared to emerge from hell itself, wreathed in smoke and flame. The effect was calculated and devastating. Sailors who might have fought bravely against an ordinary pirate captain found their courage melting away. When faced with this apparition from nightmare, he looked like something that should not exist in the rational world of wind and sail, an honest commercer, demon-made flesh, a walking violation of natural law. His clothing added to the impression, a great coat that billowed like bat wings, a tricorn hat that cast his face in permanent shadow, and a bandolier bristling with loaded pistols that promised swift death to any who opposed him. He moved across his ship's deck like a predator in its natural element. Every gesture calculated to reinforce the image of barely contained violence ready to explode at any moment. But the physical transformation was only part of the performance. Edward, now calling himself Blackbeard for obvious reasons, understood that reputation spread faster than any ship could sail. Every merchant captain who survived an encounter with him became an unwitting evangelist, carrying tales of his terrifying appearance and ruthless methods to every port in the Caribbean. Every crew member who jumped ship rather than face his wrath became another voice in the growing chorus of his legend. He cultivated stories about himself the way a gardener tends prize roses. Did he really lock his crew in the ship's hold and set it afire just to see how long they could endure? Did he truly maintain 14 wives scattered across the Caribbean? Were the orgies and drinking bouts as legendary as reported? Truth mattered less than effect, and the effect was exactly what he intended. Absolute terror at the mention of his name. The stories fed on themselves, growing more outrageous with each telling. Tavern keepers, from Port Royal to Boston, competed to tell the most hair-raising Blackbeard tale, and with each retelling, the man became more myth than flesh. He was said to be invulnerable to musket balls, to have made a pact with the devil himself, to command the very winds and tides through dark sorcery. Blackbeard encouraged every whisper, every exaggeration, every impossible tale. He understood that fear was his most powerful weapon, more effective than any cannon in his considerable arsenal. A merchant captain who surrendered immediately upon seeing the black flag saved everyone time and trouble. A crew that abandoned ship rather than fight preserved their lives and his ammunition. Terror was simply good business. By 1717, his reputation preceded him like the bow wave of a great ship. The mere rumor of his presence in an area was enough to alter shipping schedules and send nervous merchants scurrying for alternative routes. Insurance rates climbed whenever his name was mentioned in underwriters' offices from London to Philadelphia. The man had become a force of nature, a hurricane with intelligence and malice. But reputation without substance is merely noise, and Blackbeard was nothing if not substantial. His tactical brilliance was matched only by his strategic vision. He didn't simply rob ships at random like some waterborne highwayman. He studied the patterns of Caribbean commerce with the intensity of a scholar and the cunning of a born redditor. He knew when the sugar fleets departed Barbados, when the tobacco ships left Virginia, when the treasure galleons made their annual voyage from Veracruz to Cadiz. He positioned his ships like a chess master positioning pieces, always thinking 3 moves ahead, always ready to capitalize on opportunity or retreat from superior force. His alliance with Benjamin Hornigold expanded his reach and firepower. Together, they commanded a flotilla that could challenge anything short of a formal naval squadron. The Caribbean became their hunting ground, and they moved through it like wolves through a flock of sheep, taking what they pleased and leaving destruction in their wake. The prizes were substantial. The Robert and Good Intent, merchant vessels heavy with trade goods and coin. Each capture added to his treasury and his legend. Each successful raid, proof that the age of easy piracy was far from over. The merchant community watched in growing horror as their carefully constructed trade networks were systematically dismantled by men they could uncatch, couldn't predict, and couldn't bribe. But it was the capture of La Concorde that truly announced Blackbeard's arrival as a major player in the pirate world. The French slaver was a prize beyond his wildest dreams. 103 feet of sleek predator, armed with 40 cannons and capable of carrying 200 men. She was fast, deadly, and perfectly suited to his grand ambitions. He renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge, a title that carried layers of meaning for those who understood the code. Queen Anne had died in 1714, ending the War of the Spanish Succession and leaving thousands of providers without legitimate employment. The name was both homage and accusation, a memorial to better times and a promise of retribution against a world that had abandoned its most faithful servants. The ship became his floating castle, his mobile headquarters, from which he could project power across the entire Caribbean. Her cannon could outfight most merchant vessels and many naval ships, while her speed allowed him to choose his battles and escape when discretion proved the better part of valor. She was more than transportation. She was the physical manifestation of his growing power and ambition. With his new flagship, Blackbeard's operations expanded dramatically. No longer was he limited to coastal raids and opportunistic attacks. Now, he could mount expeditions that would have challenged the resources of small nations. His crew swelled to over 300 men, a small army bound together by shared danger and the promise of unimaginable wealth. The Brotherhood of the Coast, that loose confederation of pirate crews that had plagued Spanish shipping for generations, welcomed him as a peer. He was no longer a promising newcomer, but an established power whose opinions carried weight in the councils of the lawless. When pirates gathered to plan joint operations or divide territories, Blackbeard's voice was among the loudest and most respected. His hunting grounds expanded to match his ambitions. The Caribbean remained his primary theater, but his ships ranged as far north as the Carolinas and as far south as the Venezuelan coast. Spanish treasure ships, English merchants, French slavers, all were fair game for his growing fleet. The very mention of black flags on the horizon was enough to send coastal communities into panic and merchant captains into despair. But it was in the spring of 1718 that Blackbeard conceived and executed the operation that would cement his place in pirate legend forever. The blockade of Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston was no minor port or sleepy fishing village. It was one of the crown jewels of British colonial commerce, the beating heart of the tobacco trade that was rapidly making fortunes for planters and merchants throughout the Carolinas. Ships arrived daily, loaded with manufactured goods from Europe, and departed heavy with the golden leaf that had become colonial America's primary export to the world. The very idea of blockading such a port was audacious beyond reason. Charleston was defended, well-connected, and certain to summon military response from colonial and royal authorities. No pirate in his right mind would dare attempt such an operation, which was exactly why Blackbeard chose to do it. He understood that the greatest prize was not always the richest cargo, but the most spectacular demonstration of power. By successfully blockading Charleston, he would announce to the world that no port, no matter how well defended, no matter how important, was beyond his reach. The psychological impact would be worth more than any treasure chest. His timing was perfect. The War of the Spanish Succession was over, leaving few naval vessels in American waters. The colonial militias were poorly equipped and trained primarily for land warfare. The merchant community had grown complacent after years of relatively peaceful trade. Charleston was ripe for the picking, and Blackbeard intended to do the picking. On a warm May morning in 1718, the citizens of Charleston woke to find their harbor dominated by 4 pirate vessels flying the dreaded black flag. The Queen Anne's Revenge and her consorts had taken position across the Charleston bar. that treacherous stretch of shoals that guarded the harbor mouth. Nothing could enter or leave without passing directly under Blackbeard's guns. The effect was immediate and devastating. Ships already at anchor found themselves trapped, while vessels approaching from sea were forced to turn away or risk capture. The flow of commerce that was Charleston's lifeblood stopped as completely as if a dam had been thrown across the harbor mouth. For 9 days, Blackbeard held the city hostage. His crews captured several ships, attempting to run the blockade, including the Crowley, with her cargo of prominent passengers. Among the prisoners were members of Charleston's social elite, men whose ransoms would be paid not in gold but in something far more valuable: medical supplies. The ransom demand was brilliant in its simplicity and its implications. Blackbeard wasn't interested in mere treasure. He could take that from any merchant vessel. Instead, he wanted medicine, specifically mercury and other drugs used to treat what was delicately termed social diseases. The message was clear. His crew had been enjoying themselves in Port Royal and other Caribbean pleasure ports, and they needed medical attention. But the deeper message was even more significant. By demanding medicine rather than gold, Blackbeard was demonstrating that he commanded resources and intelligence networks that could identify exactly what he needed and exactly where to get it. He wasn't some desperate brigand grabbing at random opportunities. He was the admiral of a sophisticated criminal enterprise with specific goals and the power to achieve them. The colonial authorities were helpless. Governor Robert Johnson could bluster and threaten, but he had no force capable of challenging Blackbeard's flotilla. The harbor defenses were designed to repel single ships, not coordinate squadrons commanded by experienced naval officers. The militia was brave but untrained in naval warfare and completely outgunned by the pirates' artillery. For 9 long days, Charleston's merchants watched their fortunes hemorrhage as ships sat idle and cargo rotted in warehouses. The psychological effect was devastating. If Blackbeard could blockade Charleston with impunity, what port was safe? If the colonial authorities couldn't protect their most important commercial center, what could they protect? When the ransom was finally paid and the prisoners released, Blackbeard had achieved something unprecedented in the annals of piracy. He had successfully held hostage an entire city, one of the most important ports in North America, and emerged not only unpunished but richer and more feared than ever. The blockade of Charleston was a masterpiece of strategic thinking and tactical execution that would have impressed Napoleon himself. But even masterpieces can contain the seeds of their creator's destruction. The very audacity that made the blockade successful also made it impossible to ignore. Colonial and royal authorities, who might have tolerated random piracy in remote waters, could not allow such a spectacular challenge to go unanswered. The gauntlet had been thrown down, and someone would have to pick it up. Unknown to Blackbeard, as he sailed away from Charleston, forces were already mobilizing against him. In London, colonial officials were receiving increasingly urgent reports about the pirate menace in American waters. In Williamsburg, Virginia, Governor Alexander Spotswood was beginning to formulate plans for dealing with the pirate problem once and for all. The war was coming, though it would be months before the first shots were fired. Meanwhile, Blackbeard faced a more immediate crisis: the loss of his flagship. Whether through accident, sabotage, or simple misfortune, the Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground on the shoals of Beaufort Inlet, while his fleet was attempting to careen their vessels. The great ship that had been the symbol of his power was suddenly a helpless hulk, stuck fast in North Carolina's sand. Some historians suggest the grounding was intentional, a calculated move by Blackbeard to reduce his crew size and increase his personal share of their accumulated wealth. The theory has merit. By losing 2 ships simultaneously, he eliminated the need to pay and provision nearly 200 men while retaining the most valuable portable wealth for himself and his most trusted followers. If this was indeed his plan, it was executed with typical Blackbeard cunning. As word of the grounding spread, most of his crew dispersed rather than face the prospect of sharing increasingly meager resources. Those who remained were his most loyal followers, men who had proven their worth through years of shared danger and success. With this smaller, more manageable force, He could move more quickly and operate more secretly than ever before. The loss of the Queen Anne's Revenge also coincided with Blackbeard's decision to accept the royal pardon that had been offered to all pirates willing to surrender. The proclamation for the suppression of pirates, issued in September 1717, promised amnesty for any buccaneer who surrendered before the deadline and agreed to abandon piracy forever. It was a brilliant political move by the British government, offering a face-saving exit for men who might otherwise fight to the death rather than face the hangman's noose. For pirates like Blackbeard, who had accumulated substantial wealth during their careers, the pardon offered the chance to retire rich and respected rather than die poor and hunted. But Blackbeard's timing revealed either stunning miscalculation or calculated risk-taking that bordered on genius. The pardon only covered crimes committed before January 5, 1718, and the Charleston blockade had occurred in May. By accepting the pardon from Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina, Blackbeard was gambling that his most spectacular crime would be overlooked or that political considerations would prevent prosecution. Governor Eden was exactly the sort of official who made such gambles seem reasonable. Corrupt, venal, and more interested in personal profit than public service. Eden saw the pirate amnesty as an opportunity for enrichment rather than law enforcement. He happily issued pardons to Blackbeard and his followers in exchange for what contemporary accounts suggest were substantial bribes. The arrangement suited everyone involved. Blackbeard obtained legal immunity and could settle down to enjoy his wealth in relative safety. Eden received gold and political credit for solving the pirate problem in his colony. The former pirates could integrate into North Carolina's coastal communities and contribute to the legitimate economy rather than disrupting it. For a few months, the arrangement seemed to work perfectly. Blackbeard established himself near Bath Creek on Plum Point, building a house and playing the role of reformed criminal turned respectable citizen. He even married, though whether this was his first marriage or his 14th depends on which contemporary account you believe. His former crew members scattered throughout the coastal communities of North Carolina, many of them becoming fishermen, farmers, or small merchants. The gold they had accumulated during their piratical careers provided the capital for legitimate enterprises, and their seafaring skills made them valuable additions to the colonial economy. But Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia was watching events in North Carolina with growing alarm and anger. Spotswood was everything that Eden was not: honest, competent, and utterly dedicated to enforcing royal authority in his colony. He viewed the mass pardoning of pirates as nothing less than a betrayal of royal justice and a direct threat to Virginia's security. Spotswood had studied the proclamation for the suppression of pirates with the careful attention of a trained lawyer, and he had identified the fatal flaw in Blackbeard's amnesty. The January 5, 1718 cutoff date. The Charleston blockade had occurred months after that deadline, making it ineligible for pardon under any interpretation of the royal proclamation. Armed with this legal ammunition, Spotswood began gathering intelligence on Blackbeard's whereabouts and activities. He cultivated informants among the former pirates, offered rewards for information, and slowly built a comprehensive picture of his target's daily routine and defensive preparations. The hunter was becoming the hunted, though the prey remained blissfully unaware of his danger. The irony was exquisite. Blackbeard, who had built his career on superior intelligence and careful planning, was about to become the victim of exactly those same advantages turned against him. Spotswood's network of informants was as comprehensive as any intelligence service, and his sources included men who had sailed with Blackbeard and knew his habits intimately. Chief among these informants was William Howard, former quartermaster of the Queen Anne's Revenge, who provided detailed information about Blackbeard's current residence, his remaining followers, and his ship's location and armament. In exchange for this intelligence, Howard would receive a substantial reward and immunity from prosecution, a bargain that contemporary accounts suggest he was more than happy to make. By autumn 1718, Spotswood had everything he needed to mount a decisive operation against the pirates. He had legal justification, detailed intelligence, and the resources necessary to succeed where others had failed. All that remained was to select the right man to lead the expedition and provide him with sufficient force to ensure victory. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy was Spotswood's choice for this crucial mission. Maynard was a veteran of the War of the Spanish Succession with extensive experience in Caribbean warfare. He understood both naval tactics and the unique challenges of fighting pirates in the shallow, treacherous waters of the North Carolina coast. Spotswood provided Maynard with 2 ships, the sloop Ranger and the larger Pearl, which was renamed Jane for the operation. Together, they carried 57 men and enough firepower to overwhelm any single pirate vessel. More importantly, Spotswood offered substantial financial rewards for Blackbeard's capture or death, ensuring that Maynard's men would have strong personal motivation to press home their attack. On November 17, 1718, Maynard's small squadron departed Virginia waters for the final confrontation with the most feared pirate in North America. The stage was set for a battle that would determine whether royal authority or piratical freedom would triumph in the waters off the Carolina coast. 4 days later, as dawn broke over the Outer Banks, Maynard's ships approached Ocracoke Inlet, where intelligence reports placed Blackbeard's remaining vessel, the Adventure Blackbeard's last ship lay at anchor in the shallow waters. Her crew reduced to barely 24 men, but still formidable under their legendary captain's command. The battle that followed was everything that contemporary accounts promised: brutal, decisive, and worthy of the legends that would spring from it. Blackbeard, whether warned by Eden or simply alert to danger, had prepared the Adventure for combat and was ready when Maynard's ships appeared at the inlet mouth. What followed was less a battle than a collision between 2 worlds: the ordered discipline of Royal Naval Service and the chaotic ferocity of piratical warfare. Maynard's men had superior numbers and firepower, but they were operating in unfamiliar waters against an enemy who knew every shoal and current like his own reflection. Blackbeard's opening move was characteristic, bold, unexpected, and designed to maximize psychological impact. As Maynard's ships approached under royal colors, the pirate captain cut his anchor cables and drove the Adventure straight at his enemies, cannon blazing and his crew roaring like demons released from hell. The effect was exactly what Blackbeard intended. Maynard's men, many of whom had heard the legends, but never faced the reality, found themselves confronting the living embodiment of their worst nightmares. Here was the devil himself, wreathed in smoke and flame, his terrible beard whipping in the wind as he bore down on them like some maritime apocalypse. But the Adventure ran aground before she could complete her charge, leaving her trapped within range of Maynard's guns. What had begun as Blackbeard's tactical masterstroke became his death trap, and the Royal Navy officers were quick to exploit their advantage. The cannon duel that followed was brief but devastating. Maynard's superior firepower told quickly, and the Adventure's crew was decimated by round shot and grape shot from the British vessels. But Blackbeard was far from finished, and what happened next would become the stuff of legend. As Maynard's men closed for boarding, Blackbeard transformed himself into the terrifying apparition that had haunted merchant sailors' nightmares for years. His beard blazed with lit slow matches, his coat billowed like a demon's wings, and his voice boomed across the water with promises of death for any man who dared oppose him. The boarding action was hand-to-hand combat at its most primal, cutlass against cutlass, pistol against pistol, will against will in the ultimate test of courage and skill. Blackbeard fought like a man possessed, cutting down enemy after enemy with the strength and fury of a natural-born killer. In the end, it was numbers rather than skill that determined the outcome. Blackbeard fought his way through Maynard's men to reach the British commander himself, and for a moment, it seemed the pirate might achieve final victory through sheer ferocity. Maynard's sword broke under the force of Blackbeard's attack, leaving the Royal Navy officer defenseless before his legendary opponent. But as Blackbeard raised his cutlass for the killing blow, one of Maynard's men struck from behind, opening the pirate's throat with a stroke that sent arterial blood spraying across the Adventure's deck. Even then, Blackbeard didn't fall immediately. He stood for what seemed an eternity, blood pouring from his wounds, still trying to fight, still defying death itself. When he finally collapsed, his body showed the marks of 25 wounds, 5 from pistol balls and 20 from cutlass cuts. He had died as he had lived, refusing to surrender, refusing to show fear, refusing to acknowledge any authority save his own indomitable will. Maynard ordered Blackbeard's head severed from his body and hung from his ship's bowsprit as proof of victory. The man who had terrorized the Caribbean and Atlantic seaboard for years was finally dead. His reign of terror ended by British steel and determination. But death could not diminish the legend. If anything, Blackbeard's spectacular end only added to his mystique. Here was a man who had held an entire city hostage, who had commanded fleets and accumulated wealth beyond counting, who had lived and died entirely on his own terms. The stories would outlive the man by centuries, growing more fantastic with each telling. The head that Maynard displayed as his trophy became a symbol of royal justice triumphant. But it was also a reminder of what one man could accomplish when he refused to accept the limitations that society attempted to impose upon him. Blackbeard had lived as a free man in an age when freedom was a luxury few could afford, and he had died rather than surrender that freedom to any earthly authority. Within weeks of his death, newspapers from Boston to Charleston were carrying accounts of the battle at Ocracoke Inlet. The man who had made his reputation through carefully cultivated terror found that death had transformed him into something even more powerful. A legend that would inspire countless imitators and haunt the dreams of respectable citizens for generations to come. His former associates followed him to their graves with remarkable speed. Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate who had given Blackbeard his first command, was hanged in Charleston just weeks after his former subordinate's death. Benjamin Hornigold, who had taught Blackbeard the finer points of pirate leadership, vanished in a hurricane while serving as a pirate hunter. Calico Jack Rackham, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and eventually Bartholomew Robertsall, the great names of the golden age of piracy, followed Blackbeard into legend within a few short years. By 1725, the age of the Caribbean pirate was effectively over. The alliance of pirates had been broken, their safe havens destroyed, their leaders killed or captured. Royal authority had reasserted itself across the Atlantic world, and merchant ships once again sailed under protection of law rather than the whim of individual captains. But the legend lived on, nurtured by accounts like Charles Johnson's General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, published in 1724. Whether Johnson was Daniel Defoe or some other anonymous chronicler, his book established a template for every pirate story that would follow. Here were the black flags and buried treasure, the exotic locations and larger-than-life characters that would capture imaginations for centuries. Blackbeard's story, in particular, struck a chord that resonates still. Here was a man who had refused to accept the limitations of his birth, who had carved out an empire through courage and cunning, who had lived free in a world designed to keep men in chains, that his freedom came at the cost of others' suffering, that his empire was built on theft and violence, seemed almost beside the point. He had dared to be what every man secretly dreamed of being, master of his own destiny. The 20th century would make him immortal. Hollywood pirates, from Captain Hook to Jack Sparrow, owed their existence to the template established by Edward Teach. The man who had terrified the Caribbean with his burning beard became the model for every swashbuckling hero who ever drew a cutlass in defense of freedom and adventure. Even archaeology has contributed to his legend. The discovery and excavation of the Queen Anne's Revenge off the North Carolina coast has provided tangible evidence of his reality. Artifacts that prove the man behind the myth actually existed. Cannons and wine glasses, fragments of books, and personal effects hold testimony to the fact that Edward Teach was more than just a story. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Blackbeard's legacy is what it reveals about the human condition itself. In an age of increasing regulation and social control, when the frontier was disappearing, and the wild places of the world were being mapped and tamed, he represented something that civilization thought it had left behind. The possibility of absolute freedom, even if that freedom came at a terrible price. His story resonates because it speaks to that part of every human soul that chafes against authority. that dreams of escaping the suffocating embrace of respectability and social expectation. Who among us has never fantasized about abandoning our mundane responsibilities and sailing away to adventure and fortune? Who has never dreamed of being master rather than servant, captain rather than crew? Of course, the reality was far more complex and considerably less romantic than the legend suggests. Blackbeard's freedom was built upon the suffering of others, the terror of merchant sailors, the economic disruption of colonial commerce, the violence and chaos that followed in his wake like some malevolent comet trail. His empire of fear was sustained by very real brutality, and his followers were bound to him not by loyalty alone but by their own complicity in his crimes. The Caribbean of his era was a brutal place where life was cheap and death came quickly to those who made the wrong choices. The sugar plantations that generated so much wealth were powered by slave labor under conditions that would have shocked even Blackbeard as hardened crew. The merchant ships he attacked carried not just luxury goods but human cargo destined for lives of bondage and suffering. The colonial society he disrupted was itself built upon the systematic exploitation of both land and people. In this context, Blackbeard's piracy was less a rebellion against legitimate authority than a competition between different forms of predation. The planters who grew rich on slave labor, the merchants who traded in human misery, the colonial officials who profited from systems of oppression. Were they so morally superior to the pirates who merely stole from them? The question is uncomfortable because it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that most historical heroes and villains were simply different faces of the same fundamental human tendency toward exploitation and dominance. Yet there remains something compelling about Blackbeard's particular form of defiance. Unlike the plantation owners and colonial officials who hid their cruelty behind legal codes and social respectability, he was honest about what he was. He made no pretense of serving God or country or any cause greater than his own ambition. He was a predator who acknowledged his nature rather than disguising it, and there is a kind of integrity in such brutal honesty. His leadership style, too, offers insights that transcend his criminal context. The man who could transform a crew of disparate outcasts into an effective fighting force clearly understood something fundamental about human motivation and group dynamics. His ability to inspire loyalty among men who owed him nothing but shared danger suggests charismatic qualities that would have served him well in any profession he might have chosen. The theatrical aspects of his persona, the burning beard, the multiple pistols, the carefully cultivated aura of supernatural menace reveal a sophisticated understanding of psychology and propaganda that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. Blackbeard grasped that reputation could be more powerful than reality, that fear properly managed could accomplish more than force alone. In an age before mass media, he created a brand that was recognized and feared across 2 continents. His strategic thinking, too, was remarkably sophisticated. The decision to blockade Charleston rather than simply robbing individual ships showed an understanding of economic warfare that would have been out of place in a modern business school. By disrupting the flow of commerce rather than merely stealing cargo, he multiplied his impact far beyond what his limited resources should have been able to achieve. Even his decision to seek a royal pardon can be seen as evidence of strategic thinking rather than simple cowardice. He had accumulated substantial wealth during his piratical career, and the pardon offered a chance to legitimize his gains and retire in comfort. That the plan ultimately failed due to legal technicalities doesn't diminish the logic behind it. The speed with which he rose from obscure sailor to legendary pirate captain also speaks to exceptional natural abilities. In a world where advancement usually came through birth, connections, or slow accumulation of experience, Blackbeard carved out his own path through pure meritology, merit defined in terms of violence and criminality. His rapid rise suggests the kind of raw talent that might have achieved greatness in any field he chose to enter. But perhaps most significantly, Blackbeard's story illuminates the complex relationship between individual agency and historical forces. He was very much a product of his times, a privateer thrown out of work by peace, a sailor with skills suited only for violence, a man whose options were limited by the social and economic structures of early 18th century colonial society. Yet within those constraints, he carved out a space for himself that defied all conventional expectations. The War of the Spanish Succession created the conditions that made his career possible. But it was his individual choices that determined how he would respond to those conditions. Thousands of other ex-privateers faced the same circumstances, but only a handful became legendary pirates. The difference lay not in their situations, but in their responses to those situations. This tension between individual choice and historical circumstance runs throughout Blackbeard's story. He was constrained by the technology of his era wooden ships powered by wind, weapons that required close combat, communications limited to the speed of sailing vessels. Yet within those constraints, he demonstrated remarkable innovation and adaptability. His use of multiple ships and coordinated attacks presaged modern naval tactics by decades. His understanding of intelligence gathering and information warfare was centuries ahead of his time. His grasp of psychological operations would have impressed 20th century military strategists. The man worked within the limitations of his technology, while finding ways to transcend those limitations through superior organization and planning. The end of his story, too, reflects this complex interplay between individual agency and larger forces. Blackbeard's death was not simply the result of superior British firepower or better tactics. It was the inevitable consequence of his own choices colliding with the inexorable force of historical change. By 1718, the age of piracy was ending not because the pirates were defeated in battle, but because the economic and political conditions that had made piracy profitable were disappearing. Colonial governments were becoming more effective, naval patrols more frequent, merchant ships better defended. The Caribbean was being integrated into a larger Atlantic economy that had less room for freelance predators. Blackbeard's tragedy, if we can call it, that was his failure to recognize that the world was changing around him. The man who had shown such strategic brilliance in adapting to the post-war pirate boom proved unable to adapt to the post-pirate world that was emerging. His attempted retirement to North Carolina might have succeeded if he had been content to remain truly retired, but the call of the sea proved too strong to resist. The accusations of renewed piracy that led to Spotswood's campaign may or may not have been true, but they were certainly plausible. A man who had lived by violence and excitement was unlikely to find satisfaction in the quiet life of a coastal farmer. The skills that had made him a successful pirate were not easily transferable to legitimate pursuits, and the fortune he had accumulated was not large enough to support a lifestyle that matched his inflated sense of his own importance. In the end, Blackbeard was trapped by his own legend. The reputation that had been his greatest weapon became his greatest liability. He could not disappear into anonymous respectability because his face was too well known, his story too widely told. He was condemned to remain Blackbeard even when Edward Teach might have preferred a quieter existence. The battle at Ocracoke Inlet was thus not simply a clash between pirate and authority, but a collision between past and future, between the dying age of individual adventurers and the emerging era of institutional power. Blackbeard represented the last gasp of a world where a single man with sufficient courage and cunning could challenge empires. Maynard represented the new order where individual heroics were subordinated to systematic organization and superior resources. That Blackbeard nearly won, despite being heavily outnumbered, speaks to his personal qualities as a warrior and leader. That he ultimately lost speaks to the inexorable force of historical change. The age of the pirate was ending not because pirates were less capable than their predecessors, but because the world no longer had room for their particular form of freedom. Yet his death, spectacular as it was, only served to cement his immortality. The man who had lived by cultivating his own legend found that death transformed him into something even more powerful than he had been in life. The flesh and blood, Edward Teach, died at Ocracoke Inlet, but Blackbeard, the legend, was just beginning his most successful voyage. Within months of his death, his story was being told in taverns from Boston to Barbados. Within years, it had been immortalized in print. Within decades, it had become the template for every pirate story that would follow. The man who had terrorized the Caribbean for barely 2 years had achieved a form of immortality that would outlast empires. The irony is profound. Blackbeard, who lived entirely in the present moment, who seized what he wanted without thought for consequence or legacy, became one of history's most enduring figures. The man who rejected all forms of traditional immortality, marriage, children, legitimate achievement, found an immortality far more complete than any he could have imagined. His story continues to evolve even now, 3 centuries after his death. Each generation rediscovers him and finds in his tale reflections of their own concerns and aspirations. The Romantic era saw him as a figure of sublime terror, a force of nature unleashed upon a complacent world. The Victorian age portrayed him as a cautionary tale about the wages of sin and the ultimate triumph of moral order. The 20th century transformed him into a figure of rebellion against authority, a man who dared to live free in a world designed to keep men in chains. The 21st century has added new layers of complexity, seeing in his story reflections of our own struggles with globalization, economic inequality, and the tension between individual freedom and social responsibility. Perhaps this endless capacity for reinterpretation is Blackbeard's greatest legacy. Like all truly mythic figures, he transcends the specific details of his historical moment to become a mirror in which each age sees its own preoccupations reflected. The man, who began as a Bristol sailor, has become a universal symbol of human possibility and human limitation, of the dream of absolute freedom and the price such freedom demands. The archaeological excavation of the Queen Anne's Revenge has added new dimensions to this ongoing story. The artifacts recovered from his flagship provide tangible connections to the man behind the myth-wine glasses that touched his lips, books he may have read, weapons he certainly used. These objects bridge the gap between legend and reality, reminding us that Blackbeard was a flesh-and-blood human being who lived, loved, fought, and died in a specific time and place. Yet even these physical remnants cannot fully contain his story. The cannons recovered from the wreck site are impressive, but they pale beside the cannon shots that echo through centuries of storytelling. The fragments of his ship are fascinating, but they are less substantial than the ship of his reputation that continues to sail through human imagination. In the end, perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about Edward Teach, called Blackbeard, that a man who lived so briefly and died so young could cast such a long shadow across human history. His actual career as a pirate lasted barely 2 years, yet his influence has lasted 3 centuries and shows no sign of diminishing. He achieved in death what he never quite managed in life: true mastery over time itself. The governments that hunted him have fallen. The empires that opposed him have crumbled. The colonial society he terrorized has vanished into history. But Blackbeard endures, as vital and compelling now as he was when his burning beard first struck terror into the hearts of Caribbean sailors. That endurance speaks to something fundamental in human nature, something that no amount of civilization or social progress can entirely suppress. We are drawn to his story, not because we approve of his methods, but because we recognize in him something eternally human: the refusal to accept limitations, the determination to live life on one's own terms, the willingness to risk everything for the chance to be truly free. The flames in his beard may have been extinguished at Ocracoke Inlet, but they continue to burn in human imagination, an eternal reminder that even in the most regulated and controlled of worlds, the possibility of absolute freedom remains for those bold enough to seize it and strong enough to pay its price.